that gives us, that's a fairly good gauge, but it doesn't tell us anything about sort of the distribution of that wealth, right? I mean, averages or means are very information poor in many cases, right? Here's an example, right? If Bill Gates and I were sitting at a bar, and you took our average net worth, right, it would be about $25 billion. Now, of course, I have very little net worth, and Bill Gates has a lot, but it's absolutely factually correct to say that our average net worth is $25 billion. Now that, of course, is nonsensical and doesn't give doesn't give us a really good idea of the true nature of our respective wealth. Okay, so one way of looking at trying to gauge how well people are doing is to look at the distribution of wealth, right? So here we see the percentage, we see the poorest 10% of the population and the richest 10% of the population, what the total percentage of the national income held by each segment, right? And we notice in some countries it's much lower, right? In for instance, in Brazil, the poorest 10% hold very little of the wealth, whereas the richest 10% hold very, very high numbers of wealth. And we mathematicians have created a score or an index called the Gini index, GINI, to account for this distribution of wealth. And so we find the lower the number, the more equal that society is in terms of the distribution of wealth or income. So Japan, Sweden, and Germany, which are mercantilist and or social democratic countries, are much more equal in their wealth than are other countries that are much more liberal in nature in terms of political economy. We notice that poorer countries also tend to be much more unequal. Okay, the United States is traditionally the highest, the most unequal, has the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any of the sort of the advanced industrial democracies, as we see right here. Okay. Now here's here's a world map of Gini coefficient values. So we see that the green and the yellow are more equal, the red and the orange are more unequal. Okay, and so this is the Gini index for the sort of worldwide. What we see is basically certain countries are high and they remain high over time. Right, Mexico and Brazil have done very little to mitigate the high levels of inequality. Other countries have sort of moved around a bit, but are much more equal over time. Okay, and so now another important way of determining or comparing political systems is to sort of, to move beyond simple sort of wealth, to look at other aspects of well-being, right? And so this is what the United Nations Development Program has done. It's sort of taken the idea that human development is the approach, and this is Mahbub ul Haq, who is one of the founders of the Human Development Index, the HDI, argues that this is what we really want to facilitate is the development of these types of goods which people want. Okay, and so we want to enlarge people's choices. We want to give people greater access to knowledge, better nutrition and health services, more secure livelihoods, security against crime and physical violence, satisfying leisure hours, political and cultural freedoms, and sense of participation. And as you notice, this is related to GDP. I mean, it's obvious that a large GDP will facilitate the attainment of many of these, but they're not necessarily. It's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. Okay, so finally, the objective of development is to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy long, healthy, and creative lives. Okay, and Aristotle, who was some old Greek guy that I've read about, has argued that wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful for the sake of something else, right? I mean, wealth is really an instrument to what it is that we want, and we essentially want these types of things, right? Okay. Oh yeah, he's actually some old dead Greek guy. So what is the HDI? How is it measured? What are its indicators? Well, let's look at a few countries. So these are the indicators, right? So this is the HDI value. It goes from essentially potentially 0 to 1. The higher, the better. Cote d'Ivoire, which is the Ivory Coast, which is just gone through a bit of an interethnic civil type of war, is very low on the index. It actually used to be much higher, but because of the civil war. So what are the indicators? Well, life expectancy at birth, which is very low here, adult literacy, gross enrollment ratio, GDP per capita, of course, life expectancy, and education. And so we find this here in Cote d'Ivoire. Brazil, of course, is a more developed country. It's one of the BRIC countries, BRIC, with Brazil, Russia, India, and China, that are the newly industrializing countries. We'll talk about more later. So we have life expectancy of birth much higher, adult literacy much higher, etc., etc. So it's also HDI score is much higher. Remember, compared to 0.42 to 0.792. The United States is the 10th as of 2003 on this on the basis of this rank. It's very high, etc. Okay, and then Pakistan, which is also quite low. Okay. And you notice in Pakistan, the gross enrollment ratio, primary, secondary, tertiary schools, is extremely low. Right? It's ranked 135 in the HDI index, and its gross enrollment of students. In other words, 35% of all students are enrolled in primary, or potential students are enrolled in primary, secondary, and tertiary schools. So only 35%, right? Whereas the United States is about 93%. Brazil is 91%. But even a country, for instance, like Cote d'Ivoire, which ranks much lower than Pakistan on the HDI index, has a gross enrollment of 42%. Right? Pakistan's is only, as I said, is only 35%. And can you think of a reason why that would be? Think about that for a minute. Pause this while you're thinking about it. Well, the answer is female. Pakistan is a very, in many parts of Pakistan, very conservative, very traditional, in which women and females are not allowed to go to school. Okay. So comparing wealth and prosperity, so we see that while there's not as I said, there's not a perfect correlation between GDP per capita and HDI, where Sweden, which is considerably less wealthy than the United States, is higher on the HDI rank. But generally, the higher the GDP, the higher the HDI rank will be. Okay. Where can I find more data? Well, just go to there, hdr.undp, and you can find. There's also a link to it on my blog roll. Okay. So and then finally, I want to just talk about increasing levels of economic liberalization. Right, economic liberalization is a result of what's called the Washington Consensus. We'll look at that actually later when we look at Chapter 9. Has led to increasing liberalization throughout the world. All around the world. Increasing liberalization means allowing the market to function, less government and state intervention, etc. So even Japan, which is a mercantilist state, has liberalized its economy slightly over those two and a half decades or so. Okay, and here's a chart that gives us a map of economic freedom. You can find it right there. It's in my on my blog, or you can just go to my blog and just look at freedom map. Economic freedom map. And so we find, many countries, the countries that we think are the countries that are more wealthy are also the countries that are more free. Okay, and the countries that are not are not very free. All right. So we have integration and globalization. Okay. So the European bellwether, right? We have economic freedom, U.S. versus Europe, right? In which we see that the EU economies trail the U.S. in economic freedom. There's the U.S. right there, and these are the U.S. the various U.S. EU countries, the EU 15. So these are the countries that were part of the EU prior to the expansion of the European Union in 2004. You can find it at the Dallas Fed website right there. Okay, so what's the underlying message? Nations, remember, they're not nations, they're states that offer more competitive economic environments will reap greater benefits from a more open world economy. So that's from the Dallas Fed. All right.